Chapter 20 is titled, "The United States of America Should Not Adopt Universal Health Care." It's by Whitman. And in this article, the introduction begins by saying the United States has nothing close to a truly free market in healthcare, and most problems of the United States system derive from perverse incentives created by state and federal interventions in the healthcare system. So the structure of his article involves making the case for a different system based on freedom of choice with individual, family, and community responsibility. Whitman wants to show how the United States has strayed far from that ideal, and that's what's responsible for the poor outcomes. And Whitman wants to address the proposed alternative of the single-payer system and say why it can't deliver on its promises, at least not without unjustified sacrifices in terms of both healthcare performance and personal freedom. Okay, so the section on the right to healthcare versus freedom of choice investigates the question, why do people often think of healthcare as a right? Well, think about this. No one seriously proposes single-payer food, or single-payer housing, or single-payer clothing. There's not a movement for collectivized farms and national cafeterias, but what makes healthcare different? One of the things he points out here is healthcare differs fundamentally from other things that we regard as rights, like freedom of speech and religion. These other rights are often called negative rights. Why? Because the only obligation they place on others is to refrain from certain acts, such as censoring your speech or burning your church. However, says Whitman, healthcare refers to goods and services, and a right to healthcare would constitute a positive right, meaning a right that requires people to use their resources and their labor to satisfy the right. Positive rights, he says, have economic implications that negative rights do not. Now, as a matter of both logic and practice, his point in this connection is that enforcing positive rights usually means invading some negative rights. It involves restricting choices of people about how to use their own labor and property. Now, single-payer systems, he says, by definition do this. They restrict people's ability to buy and sell health services without the state's involvement and permission, among other things. Now, Whitman thinks that in choosing among various policies, we should always favor voluntarism over coercion, and we should favor diversity over one-size-fits-all solutions whenever it's possible. He makes the point by saying that people have different values and preferences. Not everybody has the same importance for health or the same view about health as everybody else. And so, for example, he thinks individuals with preferences should have those respected. His rhetorical way of putting it is this: some state health care policies, such as the recently passed Obamacare in the United States, make exceptions for Christian Scientists. And the proper response from any non-Christian scientists is to ask, where's my exception? Why should I have to join an obscure religion to exercise my freedom of choice? Okay. Now, respecting freedom, he's quick to point out, does not mean that people never need a helping hand. Rather, it means individuals have the primary responsibility for their own health. Second tier of backup is from family and community, especially in what he calls forms of private charity and mutual aid. Community efforts are preferable to state action, and eventually, he says, fine, when individual and community responsibility fall short, there can be a legitimate role for government, but even then, there's many alternatives short of a single-payer system. Now, the section titled, "What's Wrong with U.S. Healthcare?" starts off by saying, is it really true that the U.S. system produces worse outcomes than others? The statistics that are allegedly showing inferior performance in the United States, he claims, cannot be taken at face value. One of the points he makes dealing with life expectancy is that when you look at the other countries within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD countries, these numbers comparing U.S. statistics to those countries' statistics often tell a different story than some people are used to hearing. So, for example, look at the fact that the U.S. has a huge obesity rate compared to these other countries. That affects how much we spend on our health And here's another example. Nutrition and exercise are important, independent of their impact upon obesity, and anecdotal evidence suggests the United States does worse than other countries in these areas. Genetics is important. Um, Other aggregate measures, such as infant mortality and disease-specific mortality rates, suffer from similar problems to the problems that plague life expectancy figures. Okay. Now, what about when we measure healthcare performance directly? Whitman claims that more direct measures of healthcare performance indicate that the United States does better than other countries in some important areas. A couple cancer studies show that relative survival rates in the U.S. may be higher. Um, HIV/AIDS mortality ratios are better, greater use of high-tech medical equipment in the United States. We've got some low-performing areas as well, like kidney disease. But he says the performance is not what's wrong with U.S. healthcare. What is? He says, in a word, it's cost. Our expenditures do dramatically exceed those of other countries. Now, there's different ways of explaining this. Here's two, but he doesn't think these are enough. First, sicker people need more health care. So if you've got a sicker population, you're going to need more health care. Secondly, richer countries spend more on health care. But he says the health care spending gap, even when you take in these two considerations, is too large. It's too large to be blamed entirely on the differing health needs and the higher income. And so he transitions by saying, to understand why U.S. health spending is so massive, we need to consider the undesirable effects of our U.S. healthcare policy. Okay, in the section on the true story of U.S. healthcare, he explains why no intervention in policy has had such far-reaching effects as a seemingly innocuous provision in the tax code written about 60 years ago. And he talks about how World War II, it led to employer-provided health insurance, and the result is that the favorable tax treatment of employer-provided insurance has caused several major distortions in the healthcare market. And he goes through 3 or 4 of those, and all of this stands in sharp contrast to other forms of insurance, such as auto insurance. And he uses this example throughout the rest of the paper. Hardly anyone gets auto insurance through their employer. Right? Nobody buys auto insurance that covers gas fill-ups, oil changes, and car washes. Car owners understand that these are routine and expected costs of having a car. Now, he compares that to healthcare, and the situation is very different. We do have healthcare plans that cover the regular maintenance of our bodies rather than just the catastrophic incidents. And he gives one example from the birth control pill about how there's this asymmetry in the way we handle people's health decisions and the way we handle our car decisions. The peculiar tax treatment, he says, of healthcare has contributed to an unfortunate confusion between health insurance and health care. Uninsured people are often characterized as having no health care. Why? Because the notion of paying for services out of pocket seems bizarre, but that's exactly what we should be doing, paying for a much larger portion of medical services directly, like we do with our cars. The tax code expansion of employer-provided private insurance, Whitman notes, has occurred alongside a massive expansion of public insurance programs, notably Medicare and Medicaid. Public insurance, taken together with the tax-subsidized private insurance, have combined to create what he calls a massive third-party buyer problem, which means the tendency of people to purchase more services at higher prices when someone else is paying the bill. What's wrong with third-party buyers? Well, he understands this a bit by returning to the auto insurance example, and creatively says, imagine if for some reason you did buy auto insurance for gas fill-ups and car washes. You'd probably be willing to buy a lot higher priced gasoline and not even check what the price of the gasoline is. And same thing with car washes. And that's what happens with healthcare. You would probably pay less attention to price with the gas example. And as strange as these practices may sound, they are commonplace in the market for healthcare. Now, state-level regulations have also had a little bit to do with this. State legislatures have enacted a bunch of regulations, he says, that reduce insurance coverage for catastrophic events while encouraging people to buy services they don't want or need. One of these is the mandated benefits. He defines it this way: a mandated benefit is a healthcare product or service that any health insurance policy must include by law. Now, 50 states have passed about 2,100 such laws, which says a lot about the lobbying efforts of medical specialties that benefit from having more customers. As a result, mandated benefits have driven up premiums by 20%, citing one study, per state or more. And when you look at, well, maybe you could solve all these problems in one stroke with a single payer, he responds this way: a single payer is just another kind of third-party buyer. So the US and the other countries that have single payer both have third-party buyer problems. But the difference, he says, lies in how these countries have responded to the problem. The United States has responded to this third-party buyer problem by placing very few limits on care and letting the costs run wild. But the single-payer countries have responded to the third-party buyer problem by limiting care through bureaucratic means. Okay, so he gives a couple examples here. One is that the single-payer countries ration access to health care in various ways. Most importantly, they make people wait. And after talking about the waiting problems in Canada and other places, he says waiting times should rightly be considered a kind of price, a price that is paid in time rather than money, and indeed in discomfort or even life rather than money. U.S. patients sometimes wait too, of course, but U.S. patients typically do not wait as long or as often, unless you're talking about health maintenance organizations, popular in some places and times in the U.S., known as managed care. So he says, kind of rhetorically, if you want to know what single payer is like, imagine one giant HMO, one giant health maintenance organization, without even the option of choosing a different one. Now, there is a possible route for pushing down costs in a single-payer system, he notes, but only with damaging side effects, and that is pharmaceutical price controls. Okay, so let's get into the philosophy of it a bit more. In the United States, every instance in which a government program has covered healthcare expenditures with tax dollars has resulted in demands, often successful demands, to restrict personal choice. So, for example, when smoking, you might want to say it's purely a personal matter whether I smoke in my home, even if I don't have kids, right? Smokers can rightly say it's my body, it's my choice. But when the taxpayers have to pay the resulting medical bills, that position of it's my body, it's my choice kind of weakens, because I'm having to pay for your medical bills with my tax dollars as a smoker, even though I'm not a smoker myself. Okay, so what's an alternative to all this? He says there's basically three options. Option one, leave demand unchecked and let costs run wild. That's kind of the one the U.S. tends toward. Option two, constrain demand by means of centralized bureaucracy. That's what single payers want. But the third option is the one he recommends. Give people the freedom to make their own healthcare decisions, but also confront them with a greater portion of the costs of their choices. And he says, to be sure, some people will not be happy with this system, this third system, because these people would prefer to get everything they want for free. But everything for free is simply not an option, not in the United States and not anywhere else.